I'm Tina Strabotniak. I look after programming here at the library. I'd like to welcome you to the Bram and Bluma Appel Salon for this evening in celebration of Marshall McLuhan.
We're not here to do a lecture on McLuhan. We're not here to do a panel presentation.
Perpetually working technology.
And the fact that you can pull this many people out to one event where supposedly you're not going to talk, but now you are, and to kind of learn about him in that way, in kind of the context of the city. So again, I'm also calling on you to please talk and remember and think about ways that you've heard about him and think about him inside the city, because I'm new and I'm kind of learning as well, so I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
I was an immigrant in 1968 when I came to Toronto from New York to make my first home at Rochdale College. And what I thought then was, oh, I've never lived in a high-rise before. That'll be interesting. Well, yes, it was.
So he would be pontificating about some amazing something or other, and then he would ask, what do you guys think? And it has stayed in my brain all these years that he treated little 5-year-old me, I was going to say dipshit, excuse me, little 5-year-old me and academic, colleague on a par.
Mr. McLuhan is a very important guy in the city of Toronto. Mr. McLuhan is a very important guy in the country called Canada. And as Woody Allen would attest, Mr. McLuhan is a very important guy in the world.
But I thought it would be a good idea to call Dr. McLuhan and to see what he thought of this crazy new station that Moses Neimer had started, which obviously had been heavily influenced, I think, by McLuhan's work. So I called him up, and he was very good, especially with media that paid attention to him in the world, and Time Magazine was one of those. So I said, look, I wanted to get your opinions about this new startup, City Television, and he shot right back. He said, oh, I never watched television.
Karl Marx, Freud, Einstein, and McLuhan, all in the same breath. And yet, I'm a professor in the Faculty of Medicine, and I wrote an article about, well, I won't tell you what it was about, but because that would be self-promotion, but the subtitle was, A Piece of the Future Can Always Be Seen in the Rearview Mirror, which was a McLuhanism. And when I wrote it, people thought I was brilliant. Why Toronto? Maybe Toronto was ready for McLuhan. Because, I remember the Toronto where you went to the wicket and signed your name, and you had to give the names of your parents and several generations back in order to get a beer.
That Toronto was a very media-forward community just in terms of the outlets we had. In terms of the University of Toronto, it was pretty forward too. I mean, Dennis Lee and the teach-ins.
But I knew that Toronto was where the future of media was going to be. It's nothing compared to Madoc. So.
No cheese factories here, though.
No cheese factories, yeah.
The door flew open, and there was Marshall McLuhan standing in the doorway wearing a green apron with the Hebrew alphabet emblazoned on it, and a big smile on his face. Come on in, Bob. Oh, Marshall, I brought you this. Oh, thanks, Bob. He put it on the mantelpiece. Come on into the kitchen. I have lunch for you. Can anyone guess what he served for lunch? Alphabet soup. You can. This is a good crowd. They participate.
The fact is, this is the only city in which I really feel that multiculturalism works. And I was thinking of the comment that the gentleman made a bit earlier about the prevalence of media and the multiplicity of media at back in the 60s. And I wonder if that nexus of communication may or may not have something to do with, to me, the relative, the imperfect, but nonetheless, I would say compared with all the cities in the world that I've had the chance to see, the success of unconscious multiculturalism, the fact you don't think about being inclusive, but it just is in a lot of environments,
a view of what the world could be. It's a view of how, as technology continues to envelop cultures, that Toronto's starting to figure out a balance, trying to figure out a way in which people can have the creative freedoms without necessarily having the fear or the risk or the violence that affects some other cities.
The art history of Toronto is phenomenal, and it's actually invigorating, and it's probably one of the most vibrant in the world, but nobody knows about it. This is why we don't document the arts. We have, CBC, they document a lot of things, the life and times, but all I can say is that Yorkville was the center of the arts. I was there drinking coffee, and Joni Mitchell was serving me. And she said, "Excuse me, I got to go on stage to perform." So it's like jamming here.
And what Marshall McLuhan, taught us and taught me is that there's so much that we need to challenge our minds, create new innovations about those ideas that are coming about through media, through culture. And you look at Toronto, it changes every day.
The similarities we can draw between McLuhan and Toronto. It's not just that McLuhan lived in Toronto, but I think that McLuhan, as a thinker, was someone whose work was picked up by electronic media and really probed by that media itself, caught up, transmitted, rearranged. And I think that, I'm sure that McLuhan came to understand his own work a lot by looking at his own the representations of him that existed in the media. And I think that's a lot of what Toronto, as you can see in events like this, tries to do as well.
Before I throw to Luke, who has another speaker, Glenn Fairley, could you identify yourself? Are you still here, Glenn? Glenn was complaining on Twitter that we're having a bit too much 60s nostalgia. So I just wanted to make sure that those of you who aren't following the conversation on Twitter are able to know Glenn's criticism.
The medium that a lot of kids relate to, of course, is the medium that they're compelled to participate in, which is high school. And I am a high school teacher. I have been for 30 plus years and absolutely love it. And the kids that I deal with in the East End of Toronto are in a school where there's no majorities. There's no majority white kids, black kids, brown kids, yellow kids, no majority Christian kids, Jewish kids, Israeli kids, Islamic kids, whatever. And they choose to make their own world. And the number of mixed groups that you see in the hallways, mixed groups that you see in the classrooms, will really make anybody's heart just go pit-a-pat, because something's working very, very well.
For my father, the decline in celebrity and interest was actually a great boon. The important people still remained interested, and you struck up some very good conversations. But having lost some of the public interest and focus on you meant that you were free to get back to work. And we did an enormous amount of work in that last 5 or 10 years. Deliberately use an anti-environment to make the old environment visible. I must say, by the way, when the students do this, they complain bitterly, but when they see the results, they're happy as clams at high tide. And that's just one.
And little did we know, Eric, that you guys started culture jamming. Back in the day, you should appear before the city on their depositions around graffiti to talk about the role in which Toronto perhaps should appreciate some of the graffiti that adds to the figure ground juxtaposition of counter environments.
And I grew up in a small town, and all I dreamed of in life was to move to Toronto, the big city, the big smoke place where all media was happening. It was the only place to be, only place for me, because I was going to go into the media. If he was in New York, LA, Chicago, places like this, he would have been kind of like, he wouldn't have had the same experience, the same views. So I think that that Toronto kind of made McLuhan, and McLuhan kind of made Toronto.
The wonderful thing about Marshall McLuhan is he put me on to James Joyce, and what James Joyce is to Dublin, I think Marshall McLuhan is to Toronto.
We have to do something in Toronto, like everybody is celebrating him all around the world. And that's when we started the project of 100 events for McLuhan in Toronto, to really infuse the city with events so that everybody across generation and across culture understand and actually appreciate McLuhan. So I would like to thank Jesse and Tina, because I think that the event today really represents what we were dreaming about when I met Lily on July 14, exactly last year, and trying to imagine how to infuse the city of Toronto with events and to make actually the city of Toronto not only a classroom, but really a place where we are going to practice and live what McLuhan talked so much about it. And I am hoping that we can do it as creatively as he did, because what I say when I talk about Marshall McLuhan, for me, he was a poet.
This was the first of 3 events. Tonight was meant to talk about the past. Our next event, which is coming in August, tickets became available today on the Toronto Library website, is to deal with the present. So I suspect where we didn't talk a lot about the internet and social media tonight, we will at our event in August. The 3rd and final event in September will deal with the future. So that's where we'll talk about being cyborgs and the singularity event and whether or not we're prepared for immortality and, you know, whether Armageddon or the apocalypse is around the corner. So certainly feel if we didn't get to some of the subject matter that you wanted to tonight, that there will be other opportunities. And I would, if in closing, also remind you to check Agnes at the back table for other McLuhan 100 events, to thank the library and the Toronto Public Library system. I know I certainly benefit from all the great books and resources that they have available, but also from the space like this that allows us to have these conversations without compromises, without really having to worry about serving particular masters. And Toronto's a very politicized climate right now. And remember that the library system is funded by a city that cannot afford anything at this point. So there will come a time when you should think about your role in defending Toronto libraries and playing a role and making Toronto libraries a priority. So if I could end on anything, that would be it. Thank you very much for coming. I hope to see you all back in August.